All right, so we're now recording. Let's see if I can get PowerPoint running and shared. And we'll get started. All right, so there's, I know my in-studio audience can now see my PowerPoint slides. Let me share them so my remote audience can see my slides. And I think we're all good to go. So this is where we left off on Monday. We are walking through the overall purchasing cycle and what that looks like. We'll do a separate lecture on Friday about the payment cycle. The payment cycle is a lot more complicated because it involves, if you were to take a guess, which account? Not AR. You're paying for the goods that you bought on credit, which requires which? Oh, yeah. But it's risky for that same reason. It's, well, it deals with the accounts payable, but you're using what to pay down your account payable? Cash, exactly. Any transaction that involves cash is inherently risky because cash is easy to walk away, which is why when we talked about the payroll cycle, there are a lot of controls related to setting up a separate bank account, transferring only enough money into that bank account to pay everybody's salary, making sure that someone different hands out the paychecks if they do print ones, then it collects the time cards, things like that, because cash is easy to walk away. So that's a separate discussion. Right now, we're just looking at the fun part, buying things on credit. So for each segment of the process, there's a document. Those become a component of the control cycle as documentary controls. And they are, for the requisition process, well, I think we ran through this slide before, so I'm doing this as a little bit of review. What does the requisition, who submits that, and what does it support in the cycle? The requisition. Oh, there it goes. So the purchase requisition, who generates that, first of all? That's the next one, that's the PO. So you're on the right track. The people who need to buy something or who need something in their course and scope of business, they're the ones who generate a purchase requisition. That would be, when I used to work for Gap Incorporated, there were lots of people in the organization who had the right to generate a purchase requisition by shopping in our catalog, which was that approved supplier list of negotiated prices and products. The purchase order is the actual authority to buy the goods, and that's what's generated by the purchasing department. The receipt of goods, the document that establishes that that took place, is the receiving report. We saw that in this, in the purchasing, or no, now I'm doing it too, thanks Melinda. But they are mirror images of each other, like we said, so it's easy to get them confused. We saw it when one of our customers returned goods to us. We generated a receiving report to demonstrate that the goods came back into our warehouse and were returned to our inventory. Here, we're receiving new goods or raw materials from our suppliers, but we're generating the same document. We're generating something that proves that those goods and materials came into our warehouse and they are now in our possession. And finally, we get the bill that says what we owe to the vendor for buying those goods on credit. Would there be What do y'all think? Would anything look different if the company used a perpetual inventory system instead of a periodic inventory system? These guys in our simulation use a periodic inventory system for frame of reference. Exactly. So the periodic is where they wait until the end of the month to check what inventory is in stock, the end of a quarter, the end of hopefully not the end of the year. I would hope you're checking inventory more often than once a year as part of your regular inventory tracking processes. But, yeah. We talked about the perpetual inventory system being a little less risky than the periodic one. But the short answer is no, it wouldn't be any different. You're still requesting the inventory, formally ordering it through a purchase order, receiving it. The only difference would be there'd be another transaction where you're updating the inventory records at the time you receive the goods, not just updating your accounts payable. All right. So let's talk about the buying part. We talked a little bit and we talked about general controls, what it means to have a catalog of suppliers, and what the objective was. Do y'all remember what the objective of the purchasing cycle is? I just learned I can do this, so let's see if I can play. So with the purchasing cycle, your goal is to minimize your costs, and maximize the quality of goods that you receive. You want to get as much as you can for as little as possible when it comes to payment, but you also want to make sure that you've got the best quality you can buy for the price you can get. So each of these examples of what could go wrong relate to mitigating these risks: the risk of paying too much money, the risk of having too much or too little inventory on hand, and the risk of having goods that aren't what you need to run your process or aren't the quality that your customers demand. So why is too much or too little inventory a problem? What do y'all think? Well, I know, Melinda, you run a business. What happens if you buy too much inventory? Yeah, exactly. So if you have, Melinda owns a coffee shop, and if she buys too much inventory for her business, you run the risk of spoilage. And that's true of other businesses as well. I think of that, I'm a fan of that TV show, The Office. And I think of that scene where Michael Scott thought it would be hilarious to drive the forklift around the warehouse. And he destroys all of those boxes of paper that are to go and those shelves where they keep the goods. That's another risk of too much inventory, although a different example than in Melinda's business, in that when you've got too much inventory on hand, something can go wrong. But what's the converse? What if you have too much or too little inventory on hand? Exactly. When your customers come in, you don't have the product to sell. Case in point, I grabbed an iced tea before an afternoon meeting the other day. And I said, I would like a peach green tea to Starbucks. And they said, we don't have the peach juice. And I said, what? And they said, would you like one of our other fine teas? And I said, no. Get me one of the ones that's not caffeinated, I suppose. But yeah, the risk when you have too little inventory is pissing off your customers, for lack of a better word. And I mean, Starbucks knows they've got me hooked. They're not going to lose me as a customer, but it's really going to hurt small businesses like Melinda, who specifically, I go to her coffee shop to write sometimes, and you have customers who come in from out of town. Oh, I love this place from when I used to live in Abilene, and Do you have that chocolate lemon spoon cake? Ooh, not today. I don't have my spoon cake. We're not going to make a trip to your coffee shop next time we're in town. It's a different risk for different businesses, but yeah. So how do we control that? We can implement a perpetual inventory system so that we know what's on hand all the time. We can use barcodes and RFID tags, again, to keep track of what's on hand at all times. Review and approve purchase requisitions, and then use a centralized purchasing function. I used to work for the federal government, and GAP had a centralized purchasing function that they used through their catalog. The Department of Energy did not. Anybody who had purchasing power in the organization could buy things on behalf of the Department of Energy, which meant suppliers got set up multiple times in the database, which means prices got misquoted in the database because they didn't have that centralized function. What about prices that are too high? What could go wrong if you're paying more than you should for a specific piece of inventory or raw material? What could go wrong there in your organization? Yeah. Exactly. Oh, I did the other one first. My bad. So talk about inferior goods, and then I'll put those up there. So yeah. So with inflated prices, when you pay too much, it cuts into your profits and limits your ability to resell the goods. So some controls that would help mitigate that, using a standardized price list. And we have that in our simulation that we've been working through. We have a negotiated set of prices with our supplier for our sporting goods and equipment. Use competitive bidding. The federal government does that. Almost everything they buy goes through a competitive bidding process to make sure that they get, again, the best cost is what the strategy is. The lowest cost for the best quality, or the level of quality needed. Reviewing purchase orders to make sure that you are getting something that meets this or this requirement. And budgets. Budgets were something that we lived and died by in the federal government. There's a good, how many of you have taken costs? And some of you are taking Mr. Starbuck cost accounting class right now, right? Yeah. Cost accounting, it's all about budgets and knowing what's normal, what's abnormal. Budgets are a great tool for keeping track of prices in that way. And then what about inferior? So let's move on to the third one, inferior goods. What's the risk with inferior goods? What happens? I think more of I think of inferior goods, I think of the assembly line with that Corvette that I want to buy someday. If they buy lower quality steel, it's going to impact the quality of their Corvettes that are coming off the line. You might have more warrant. It wouldn't initially be noticeable, but in the long run, you might see more warranty claims or more recalls later on down the road. So this is why the ultimate goal is best cost. So the best quality you can get at the lowest price. So a way to mitigate that is by limiting purchases to approved suppliers, like the catalog, like GAP used, monitoring supplier quality and how often you need to reorder those goods if they don't meet your quality control standards, and then holding managers accountable for rework. That's another example that kind of goes back to my Corvette. And that if the manager is going to potentially lose a bonus for producing goods that aren't the required quality, the manager is more apt to pay attention to the quality of the goods and enforce that. That's something you'll talk about really more in auditing class. We got it a little bit in this class, but you'll see that again in audit when you talk about the internal control structure and the control environment. All right, so we've already talked about unreliable. Well, what could go wrong when you pay too much or when you get crappy goods? Another risk that kind of relates to having too much or too little inventory is the risk of unreliable suppliers. I know I pay a contractor to mow and weed and edge my yard, and I've had to get a new one because the one I had last summer wasn't reliable, which meant I wasn't getting the services I needed on the time frame that I would have desired. So the controls there to prevent unreliable suppliers is only purchasing from suppliers who possess quality certifications and collecting and monitoring supplier performance data. We've talked about this. Unauthorized suppliers, maintain a catalog of suppliers, and then reviewing and approving purchases from new suppliers. That makes sure that you're dealing with people you know and who can provide goods that on the schedule you need, in the quantity you need, the quality you need, and the price that you've already established. And then reviewing and approving purchases from new suppliers. That keeps someone from slipping a new supplier into the database to pass some money to their friends. And that gets to this final what could go wrong, which is kickbacks. If you look at government frauds and Department of Justice cases against government contractors, you see kickbacks a lot where someone says, okay, I'll let you have the big government contract if you throw me the subcontract on that one. Or one of the, not a story with a happy ending necessarily, although I guess for me it was. One of my former employers got busted by the watchdog, the internal auditor at the Department of Interior, because they were giving gifts. They were giving gifts to the federal employees who were responsible for awarding contracts to their organization. And they're being sneaky about it, or so they thought, in that they would take feds on these expensive golf outings. Oh no, I got it. I'm a member of the country club. It's no big deal. This one's on me. Oh, hey, do you want a round of drinks on this golf hole? Well, I can take care of that. So that the feds were buddy-buddy with the contractor, and the contractor got preferential treatment when it came time to award those accounting contracts. And I had already left the firm when they got busted for that wrongdoing. It was in the Washington Post, never a good thing when your business practices make the front page of the Washington Post. But this is a valid concern when you're purchasing goods. And one way to prevent it is by just prohibiting gifts to the employer from suppliers altogether. I think we had a limit, like it was a de minimis limit. So a contractor could come bring us donuts. Those are, I don't know what the rate is for a dozen donuts nowadays, but that's such a small amount that it wouldn't be seen as buying our loyalty. Another way is to impose job rotation and mandatory time off. Financial disclosures. I used to have to do that when I was an auditor to say, I don't own any stock that could unduly influence me as an auditor. Things like that. And then finally, periodic supplier audits. Any questions about those purchasing controls? Anyone online? All right. So shipping goods to the customer. This is, as we talked about, The purchasing process is the mirror image of the selling process. So the controls in this process or sub-process are really the same as the controls related to shipping goods to customer, in that you're making sure that the goods that you receive from the supplier are protected and that they're not being stolen when you receive them. So something that could go wrong, accepting unordered items. A control that would fix that is refusing goods without an authorized purchase order. Making mistakes in counting. The control with that, like we've talked about before, is using barcodes and RFID tags, requiring signatures as indication of approval, and then making the people in receiving actually count the number of goods received rather than just blindly accepting what's on the invoice or shipping document. And then we talked about theft of inventory when we talked about the selling process as well, restricting physical access, recording any transfers or movement, periodic inventory counts, and then segregation of duties. Any questions there? So again, in the selling process, we are generating an invoice to the customer. In the purchasing process, we're receiving the invoice from the customer. So it's the same grouping of controls that you would see when you generate an invoice to your customer. This time we're on the receiving end. So what could go wrong? Well, the supplier gives you the wrong invoice, the wrong amount, incorrect calculations. The control that would fix that is verifying invoice accuracy, requiring detailed receipts when you use a purchasing card, and then restricting access to the supplier master data. And then, any questions there? All right. So the last one, again, this time, instead, it's the same process. We're updating the AP subsidiary ledger, not the receivable ledger. But as with any time you're touching the journal or the ledgers, it's the same grouping of control. So as a whole, we would need to implement data entry controls and then periodically reconcile the subsidiary ledgers with the general ledger control account. When we were doing it with the supplier side or the customer side, we would look at all of our individual AP subsidiary ledger accounts, and they should add up to our total AR journal amount. On this side, we're looking at all of our different suppliers and summing it up to what's in the purchases journal. Any questions? Again, these are mirror images of the same process that we were just tested on. So if you think what I'm giving when I'm selling is what the customer receives from me, this time you're the customer before you're the seller. That's an easy way to remember and build on what you already know. All right, so now let's maybe, there's my cursor. There it is, okay. Now we're gonna work through an example of purchasing from our systems understanding aid. And we're gonna work through an example of receiving from our systems understanding aid. Like I said, we will move to the cash portion we'll begin on Friday with the cash receipt or cash payment portion, looking at the controls required there. So starting out as per usual, we're going to take a look at their system flow diagram. And what we see here is that we start the process with the receipt of an oral requisition. So someone, probably Nancy, because she's in charge of receiving, notices that inventory levels for one of their products is getting low. So she makes a request to purchase certain goods. She would then prepare a pre-numbered purchase order that has the carbon copy, so it creates copies in duplicate. And then the purchase order gets signed and approved by Kramer. One of the copies goes to the vendor, and then the other copy gets filed in the vendor file here in our accounting filing system. When the goods actually arrive from our supplier, Nancy is in charge of receiving, and then she would generate a pre-numbered receiving report, which we saw when we processed a return, which was this subset of the diagram. And then the receiving report would be completed and sent up to Jim in accounting, who reconciles that with the purchase order. And once the invoice is received, logs that information in the purchases journal and the accounts payable subsidiary ledger. And then here's all the updating here. What's one thing that jumps out at you on this? We've been talking about controls, because that's my favorite topic as a former auditor. But what jumps out at you on the process flow diagram? Just something inherently potentially not good. Exactly. You probably couldn't hear it, remote attendees, but we heard some murmurings in the class about how, wait, Nancy's generating the purchase order as well as receiving the goods. That's problematic because she could buy goods and then abscond with them for her own benefit. How do they mitigate that risk a little bit? And there is what's called a compensating control to try to prevent Nancy from committing evil doing. Well, they have, it's right here. They've got the big boss, Kramer, reviewing the purchase order and approving them before they go out to the vendor. That's an example of a authorization control and a supervisory review. And that ensures that, mitigates some of the risk that Nancy's buying things and then receiving them without the company knowing. I thought that was interesting to me. So we're going to look at transactions 3 and 4 in our systems understanding aid document. In transaction 3, we are generating a purchase order. Let me see if I can pull that up. I lost my print copy of them. If you've ever been in my office, you know that organization isn't my strong suit. Oh wait, that's the wrong document. Nope, that's the wrong document, my bad. There we go. so here's our list from the Systems Understanding Aid. And transaction number 3 reads that we figured out that, oh, we're running low on inventory. We need to order more goods from Velocity Sporting Goods. So using purchase order number 328, generate an order for the following goods. And they give us the vendor address, the freight carrier, the FOB shipping point, and then the allowances. So it says to refer to the price list of our master. This blue document, document number 3, to generate the purchasing order. And at this point, it advises us that we're not receiving the goods yet. We're just placing the order. So I'm going to attempt to move this back over to my secondary screen so that we can look at this together. That time it. All right, so here's the purchasing order. What internal control jumps out at you on the top of this document? I'll narrow it down what we're looking at. Yep, that they've got a separate address for receiving invoices. That's a good control because it poses the segregation of duties. It means that Jim in accounting gets the invoice, not Nancy in receiving. What else? What's another document control that we see on this? Exactly. I'm going to circle this. You don't have to do this on the one that you turn in. But pre-numbered and sequentially numbered documents. That, well, I'll ask y'all, what does that allow you to do that using randomized numbers would not? Exactly. It allows you to match the documents. It allows you to identify gaps in sequence. It would allow you to identify duplicated numbers. Yeah, so I think those are the big 3. So yep, these are examples of document controls. So we are purchasing our goods from, on the one that I'm sharing in Zoom. Oh, my bad. Interesting. Okay, let me go back to the other. Those of you watching remotely, you can see the purchase order, right?
No.
What are you seeing right now? Anything?
It's showing your computer screen, the check figures.
Check figure. Okay, so everybody's seeing the same thing. Good. Good deal. Yeah, then let me change that over. Thanks for y'all's diligence. Let's try this. Now, can you see the purchasing order?
Yes.
Oh, and those of you watching at home cannot. So let me. Now, I think now everybody's on the same page, right? We can all see the purchase order?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. So we are sole supplier for the purchase of sporting goods is Velocity Sporting Goods. And their address is 1285 Colgate Ave in Pierre, South Dakota. $57501. We are, do we have a ship to Audra? Okay, the date of today's transaction is December 16th. Ship via I don't want to send y'all too far astray. Oh, that's why. We're gonna bill us for delivery. Allowance, none. We are purchasing per the instruction. I'll get started on this, but you have this information on blue pricing list. 115 B019. With we are purchasing 115 of these basketball pole pads. This time we're buying. This is the rate we would use if this were an invoice we were preparing. This is the rate we're using for what we're buying at wholesale. The cost each is $94. Any questions about that? All right. So it looks like the other items are 125. Oh. Which address should we use for the ship to information? Yeah, whichever, the one that's on the logo, exactly. It doesn't specify receiving at a different location. So unless they give us information otherwise, we would just use this 1978 Michigan Avenue in Chicago, Illinois, 60612 as our ship to address. What's the one last thing we need to do to get this process rolling? We just talked about it as an example of an internal control embedded in the process. Exactly. We need our boss to sign off on the purchasing order. So the last piece of evidence that we would need on this document is Ray Kramer's signature to get the ball rolling. So what happens to, do you remember what happens to these documents once we prepare them? We've got it in duplicate. There's a yellow copy and a white copy. Exactly. So the white copy, this is an internally generated document, and Warren uses a color coding system to help keep track of documents throughout the process. So the white copy of the document, the one that we wrote on, that would go in our vendor file in our filing system for this manual system understanding aid. And then this one, do whatever makes sense for you. I gave you the reference guide that says where this will eventually end up. And we know it's a yellow copy. It's eventually going to end up in the accounting folder. But if it makes more sense to you to put it in the temporary folder until we receive the goods in a subsequent step, that's fine as well. I think when you submit the project, it'll be in the accounting folder. So now we've authorized the purchase of goods on behalf of Warren Sports Supply. We will now receive on Wednesday, no, today is Wednesday, good gracious. On Friday, we'll practice receiving the goods and we'll start with the cash disbursements process.
So do we need to fill in the ship to section or?
Yeah, do that. I didn't because I was trying to talk and demonstrate at the same time, but on yours you should. Well, why would you fill in the ship to box there with the address, even though it's printed on the logo?
For clarification?
For clarification, yes, but what's my other favorite phrase in the whole entire world? For internal controls, exactly. If you don't fill in the correct address for Warren Sports Supply there, you run the risk of Nancy inadvertently having those goods shipped to her own house, or Ray Kramer having those goods shipped to his own house, or shipped to a third party altogether. So yes, do that on your final version. All that to say. All right. Any other questions? All right. Enjoy your dreary day here in Abilene. It's a good day for hot coffee at Mezzanese. So, or soup, that's true. You have soup now too. I'll get this video posted after class and I will see you on Friday. And meeting for